Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very pleased to welcome Natalie Baldwin, who is a specialist on geopolitics of Russia and Ukraine. Now, one of her books, titled Ukraine's Zbigniew's Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard and How the West Was Checkmated, is extremely pertinent for understanding the current crisis in the Russia-Ukraine relations. The book describes and analyzes the series of events that have been responsible for the current war. And this book also talks about the historical and geostrategic moves undertaken by the US and NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union to control the Eurasian landmass. The book is about 390 pages long and points to the need to take into account a whole complex of factors in order to form a proper picture of the conflict. Now, unfortunately, there is a great dearth of accurate, unbiased information in the Western mainstream media. Factual details that contradict the mainstream narrative are censored or suppressed or presented in a very distorted way. There's a distinguished Australian journalist and documentary filmmaker, John Pilger, and he's known for very honest reporting. So this is what he has to say about how the current war is being reported in the Western media. Almost nothing one reads in the Western press about the invasion of Ukraine is to be trusted. I have never seen a coverage so utterly consumed by a tsunami of manipulative jingoism. And what should be making big headlines is not being presented in the mainstream media. So I feel this is truly a great opportunity to learn about the nature of the Russia-Ukraine crisis from Natalie, who has been studying the situation for many years now. Thank you so much, Natalie, for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I want to thank everyone who is participating in watching this presentation. I have a lot of material to cover in my presentation today, so I'm going to get right into it. In order to conduct a rational foreign policy, one must understand the other country's point of view. Understanding that viewpoint means understanding the other side's history, geography, and culture. In other words, it means having context provided. The mainstream corporate media has not provided this crucial service or provided a platform for those who can, with respect to Iraq, Libya, and many of the other nations with whom we've gone to war. The so-called experts the mainstream corporate media consult often have conflicts of interest, nefarious agendas, and/or lack an objective understanding of the nation about which they are writing or talking. This has certainly been the case when it comes to reporting on Russia, a country with which the stakes are potentially much higher. The point of journalism and even academic expertise is supposed to be an attempt to understand the subject of study and to impart the information gleaned. It's not to judge or condemn or romanticize. As journalists, academics, and analysts, we're all human and will have our opinions about a subject. But as professionals, we must put that aside as much as possible and seek to understand and impart, to inform and to educate. The point of my presentation today is not to get you to like what I'm going to say, but to impart information that is necessary for people to know about the history of Ukraine, its divisions, and how the West has apparently exploited those divisions on behalf of its own geopolitical agenda, and how things have looked from Russia's perspective and what led to their actions. I think it's necessary to go over this history and context, not to justify any particular party's actions, but to truly understand how this conflict came about and what important lessons can be learned from it. Visual number 1. There are 8 basic points that I'm going to go over in my presentation today. 1, the historical divisions in Ukraine. 2, the Maidan protests and coup. 3, the anti-terrorist operation and civil war in Donbass. 4, Crimea. 5, de facto NATO membership. 6, Russia's red line warnings. 7, how Russia perceives its national security. And 8, Putin's attitude toward the West. Ukraine, a divided country. Visual number 2. Ukraine, along with Russia, had constituted a loose federation of East Slavic tribes known as warrior traders that were ruled by the Rurik dynasty from the 9th through the 13th century in what is historically referred to as Kievan Rus. Ties were cemented by the Orthodox Church when Prince Vladimir chose that religion for his people in the 10th century. By the time of the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, the area had degenerated into rivalries among various princes who'd lorded over a dozen or so independent areas. When the Mongol massacre killed about 2/3 of the population, some of the survivors managed to flee closer to what is modern-day Moscow, and those who remained were forced into subjugation, rupturing Slavic bonds. Those from the southern part of the Kievan Rus region later became known as Ukrainians and were cut off and later ruled over by Poles and Lithuanians. In the mid-17th century, the Treaty of 1654 united Ukraine to Russia as an autonomous region. This led to a 13-year war between Russia and Poland, which resulted in the division of Ukraine between the two countries. From then on, the Ukrainian-speaking parts of Poland-Lithuania were progressively conquered by the Russian Empire, leading many Orthodox Ukrainians to strongly identify with Russia. From the late 18th century on, Russians referred to Ukraine territory as Malorussia or Little Russia, viewing Ukraine and the Ukrainian language as having derived from the greater Russian history and culture, and later sought to standardize it to Russian. The western parts of modern-day Ukraine had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries, while the southeastern portion was part of the Russian Empire. An independent Ukrainian state emerged very briefly in the years of the Russian Revolution and early Civil War period. But the project failed in 1919. From then until World War II, parts of Ukraine were ruled by Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Soviet Russia, with the latter becoming a Soviet republic ruled by the Communist Party. Russian and Soviet rule of Ukraine in the 19th and 20th centuries created complex patterns of migration, with significant parts of southern Ukraine settled by Russians, including those who came to work in the mines and factories of the Donbass region, bringing the Russian language with them. In 1991, Ukraine gained independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Based on the history outlined above, Ukraine found itself with ethnic, cultural, and linguistic divisions within the country. According to British scholar Richard Sakla in his book Frontline Ukraine, there emerged two different and irreconcilable views of how to organize the Ukrainian state. The first is the monist approach. This is the belief that Ukraine is a single cultural and political entity. Political philosophy underpinning this view is heavily influenced by the Galician ethno-nationalist identity of Ukraine, rather than a civic or pluralistic one. It advocates for the Ukrainization of society, including a unitary state with one language. It partly draws on the thinking of those who were trying to create the independent state that failed in 1919. That failure was subsequently blamed on democracy, liberalism, and a lack of will, paving the way for fascist sympathies. In the early 1930s, Ukrainian ultranationalists, led by Stepan Bandera, violently resisted Polish rule in Galicia. In 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union made Galicia part of the Soviet Union, a region that had never been under Russian imperial rule, and today remains the most strongly nationalist and anti-Russian part of Ukraine. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Ukrainian ultranationalists supported Germans, thinking they would assist in the creation of an independent Ukraine. The Ukrainian ultranationalist army, who were supporters of Bandera, massacred 70,000 Poles in Volyn in 1943, and is estimated to have killed about 130,000 in eastern Galicia by 1945. Statues of Bandera have been erected throughout western Ukraine starting in October of 2007. Streets have also been named after him, and a giant portrait of Bandera was displayed on stage at the Maidan protests in 2014. The alternative view of how to organize the state is based on pluralism and acknowledges that Ukraine has a common ancestry with Kievan Rus and emphasizes a civic Ukrainian identity rather than an ethno-nationalist one. The pluralist approach says that cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity must be acknowledged and respected. It calls for a degree of decentralization. However, support for this is complicated by the fact that centralization benefits certain financial as well as political interests, including oligarchs. For its first 2 decades of independence, Ukraine was engaged in a clumsy balancing act between the nationalist West, the Russophile East, and the relatively moderate central part of the country. Many Ukrainians no doubt wanted to enjoy the perceived benefits of the West. But there was no significant call to sever Ukraine's economic relationship with the country it had the most familial and social ties with and constituted its biggest trading partner, Russia. According to polls at the time, there was not majority support for NATO membership either, but rather continuing support for non-alignment. The Maidan protests and coup. That changed in 2013 when the West provided an ultimatum to Ukraine in the form of the EU Association Agreement. This agreement actually called for Ukraine to implement deeply unpopular austerity measures, give up its trade with Russia, though unlike the EU, Russia accepted many Ukrainian exports, and synchronize its security with NATO. Russia had requested three-way talks with the EU and Ukraine to negotiate a deal that would accommodate all three parties, but the EU rejected out of hand any attempts at such a compromise. The EU, led by Germany, was effectively forcing Ukraine to choose between the West and Russia. Viktor Yanukovych, who was the Ukrainian president at the time, decided to reject the agreement in favor of a deal from Russia consisting of a $15 billion loan and reduced gas prices. The protests on the Maidan started out peacefully in the late autumn of 2013 and expressed a desire for reform and closer ties with the EU. Politics in this situation did make for strange bedfellows, as Ukrainian liberals who supported Maidan, mostly educated professionals and students from Kiev, were allied with ultranationalists, mostly from Western Ukraine. What the two had in common was a belief that rejecting Russian and Soviet influence would be best for Ukraine's future. Liberals wanted the perceived benefits of European modernity over what they saw as a backwards Russian and Soviet legacy, represented by the mine and factory workers of the Donbass. And ultranationalists wanted a culturally and ethnically purified Ukraine. I'm going to take a moment to discuss a little bit more about the US interference leading up to and during the Maidan. The National Endowment for Democracy, also known as NED, is a US government-funded organization that was created in the 1980s to, according to its co-founder, Alan Weinstein, quote, do today what was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA, end quote. According to the National Endowment for Democracy's 2013 report, quote, the objective of the endowment in most of the countries where it is active in the European region is helping new democracies to succeed. For Eastern and Southeastern Europe, this goal is best met through these countries' accession to the European Union and NATO. In the European region, the 2013 priority countries will include Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Kosovo, end quote. The National Endowment for Democracy funded 65 media and activist projects in Ukraine in the year leading up to the Maidan protests. According to reporting in the Financial Times in December of 2013, a network of Ukrainian NGOs played a key role in facilitating the Maidan protests. These included New Citizen and Center UA. According to additional reporting by journalist Mark Ames in February of 2014, Center UA was funded by USAID, which has its own history of funding regime change projects, and American billionaire Pierre Omidyar. On February 4th, 2014, a leaked telephone conversation between State Department official Victoria Nuland and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, revealed the two discussing what appears to be a plan to use the protests to facilitate an illegal overthrow of the democratically elected government of Ukraine. Nuland and Pyatt discussed who should become Ukraine's new prime minister, the man who would, in fact, weeks later become the prime minister, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, and to have the UN, quote unquote, glue the plan to, quote unquote, midwife a change of government. That change in government, as we shall see later, would conveniently result in leaders who would support the Washington agenda. It should be noted that Nuland mentioned then Vice President Joe Biden as the American official who would be needed to approve the action. Visual number 3.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here. Especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Boke and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. You know, I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work. I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah,
okay.
I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So
okay.
Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks.
Visual number 4.
Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something.
Thank you for coming. This was Newland and Pyatt visiting Independence Square in Kiev in December, handing out food to protesters and police. This latest episode is embarrassing for the US and allows Russia to argue that the opposition is being manipulated by Washington, something that Barack Obama has always denied.
Now I'd like to point out that many Western politicians spoke on stage at the Maidan protests, including members of the US Congress. Visual number 5.
Hello, how are you?
People of Ukraine, this is your moment.
Народи український, це ваш момент.
This is about you, no one else.
Це про вас.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve.
Це про ваше майбутнє, про майбутнє вашої країни. Це про майбутнє, на яке ви заслуговуєте.
A future in Europe.
Майбутнє Європи.
A future of peace.
Майбутнє миру.
With all of your neighbors.
Майбутнє всіх ваших сусідів.
The free world is with you. America is with you. I am with you. And the destiny you seek lies in Europe.
І ваша доля, як ми вважаємо, знаходиться в об'єднаній Європі.
Ukraine will make Europe better, and Europe will make Ukraine better.
Thank you. Thank you.
Imagine for a moment if representatives of the Russian government or the Chinese government had actively encouraged the Occupy Wall Street protesters or the January 6th protesters who later rioted. Would the segment of Americans who opposed those actions have considered such encouragement by a foreign government to be an illegitimate interference in our internal affairs? Getting back to the timeline of the Maidan, The movement was hijacked by the ultranationalist forces who utilized violence beginning on February 18, 2014, with a major march in Kiev. This event was initially billed as a peaceful offensive on the Ukrainian parliament, but there was an inability or unwillingness of the rest of the Maidan movement to keep the protests peaceful. Over the coming days, a massacre, initially blamed on Yanukovych's forces of police and protesters on the Maidan, was carried out by the ultranationalists. According to an independent investigation by Germany's ARD TV into the events surrounding the violence on the Maidan, found that sniper shots fired on February 20th, which resulted in almost 100 deaths, came primarily from buildings controlled by the Maidan protesters, including members of Right Sector. A more in-depth forensic investigation was conducted by Dr. Ivan Kachanovsky, a Ukrainian-Canadian academic. His conclusions supported the ARD report. Visual number 6. This will show you some of the activities that happened on the Maidan after violence took over. This is all consistent with then Estonian Foreign Minister's account to then European High Commissioner Catherine Ashton in an intercepted phone call posted to YouTube on February 26, 2014, wherein he stated that his sources, including a renowned doctor who was an ardent supporter of the original Maidan protests, reported forensic evidence indicating that the snipers were Maidan protesters. The Estonian foreign minister also reported that members of the Ukrainian parliament had been beaten and threatened during the period in question. Visual number 7.
All the evidence shows that people who were killed by snipers from both sides, among policemen and people from the streets, that they were the same snipers killing people from both sides. So that, and then she also showed me some photos. She said that as medical doctor, she can, say that it is the same handwriting, the same type of bullets, and it's really disturbing that now the new coalition, that they don't want to investigate what exactly happened, so that there is now stronger and stronger understanding that behind snipers, it was not Yanukovych, but it was somebody from the new coalition.
Those same violent extremists rejected a February 21st agreement negotiated by representatives from France, Germany, and Poland with the Yanukovych government. That agreement provided for the peaceful resolution of the months-long standoff on the Maidan with early elections and a devolution of power that would have resulted in Yanukovych leaving office before his original term expired. After the installation of the pro-Western coup government, laws were proposed to ban the Russian language, later rescinded, and ultranationalists were given cabinet posts in the education and interior departments, the latter of which had jurisdiction over the police. Yatsenyuk was installed as prime minister and the EU agreement was signed. The anti-terrorist operation against the Donbass and the beginning of the civil war. Residents in parts of Ukraine that had ethnic, cultural, and linguistic ties to Russia, including the Donbass, were extremely alarmed by the illegal change of government, as well as the violence and anti-Russian rhetoric associated with it. Professor Serhiy Kudulya of Baylor University states in his in-depth study on the Maidan protests that the new Kiev government did make an attempt to negotiate with the rebels. However, one is left to wonder how seriously this was supposed to be taken by the rebels when one of the two men that Kiev sent for this purpose was neo-Nazi activist Andrei Parubi, who participated in the violence of the Maidan. This attempt at negotiation occurred only after the Donbass cities of Donetsk and Luhansk had successfully held a referendum calling for self-determination, which was viewed as a bargaining chip to gain as much autonomy as possible. These negotiations failed, and the newly installed Kiev government decided to use force against the Donbass rebels, declaring an anti-terrorist operation against the region. Moreover, the rebellion originally called for federalization, with only a minority calling for an independent state known as Nova Rossiya. These calls would understandably increase later on after months of Kiev's anti-terrorist operation against the Donbass, which included shelling civilian neighborhoods and unleashing vicious neo-Nazi battalions to compensate for many Ukrainian army conscripts' lack of stomach at the time for attacking their fellow Ukrainians. These attacks continued after the Minsk agreements, albeit at a lower rate than in 2014 to 2015. According to UN statistics, around 14,000 Ukrainians had died in the Donbass since the start of Kiev's anti-terrorist operation against them until February of 2022, with about 80% of those victims on the rebel side. It is interesting to note the contrast of how these victims of war, many women and children blown apart, were treated by the Western media. No howls of outrage or calls to quote unquote do something, even risking World War III to stop it. There was barely a peep out of Western media or officials when the Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, declared in October of 2014 about his fellow Ukrainians in the Donbass in reference to the Kiev government's revoking pension payments and forcing them to hide from shelling, quote, "We will have jobs, they will not. We will have pensions, they will not. Our children will go to schools and kindergartens. Theirs will hide in the basements," end quote. Visual number 8.
Тому що у нас робота буде, у них немає. У нас пенсії будуть, у них немає. У нас піклування під дітей, під людей, під пенсіонерів, під дітей буде, у них немає. У нас діти підуть до школи, до дитячих садків, у них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах, бо вони нічого не вміють робити. І так, і саме так ми виграємо цю війну.
The Poroshenko government made it clear soon after signing on to the Minsk II agreement in 2015, which called for dialogue with the rebels on elections, passing of a law in Kiev to grant special status to the rebel regions, amnesty, and resumption of economic and social services, that it would not implement it. In fact, Poroshenko this past June admitted publicly that the Minsk agreements were a way for Ukraine to buy time to strengthen its armed forces. Since then, both the German chancellor and French president of the time, who'd helped negotiate the Minsk agreements, have confirmed Poroshenko's admission. It was also recently reported by the Washington Post that top US diplomat William Taylor discouraged the next Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, from pursuing the Steinmeier plan for implementing the Minsk agreements in 2019. Ukraine's ultranationalists, who have power out of proportion to their percentage of the population due to their willingness to use violence, made it clear that any moves to make what they perceive to be concessions to the Donbass or Russia would be gravely dangerous. They used violence on more than one occasion to pressure the Poroshenko government. Zelensky, an actor and comedian with no political experience, defeated Poroshenko by a huge margin in the 2019 election by running as a peace candidate. It didn't take long for Zelensky to also realize that the ultranationalists would derail any attempts he made for peace, which would require disarming them. This was illustrated when Zelensky traveled to Zalot, situated on the line of contact in the Donbass, to admonish the ultranationalist militias, led by the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, to disengage. The militias refused, and Zelensky was forced to back down as other armed extremists threatened to descend on the area if Zelensky pressed the issue. This rendered the Minsk process effectively dead in practical terms, and Zelensky soon began cooperating with the ultranationalists, who'd been integrated into the Ukrainian military. He also allowed the Interior Ministry to deploy the ultranationalist vigilante brigades throughout Ukraine. He has even presented ultranationalist fighters with state awards. It should be noted that both Zelensky and the Azov battalion, along with other ultranationalist militias, have a common financial benefactor in the form of Ukrainian oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky. What about Crimea? How do the Crimeans view what happened in Ukraine? And what led to the referendum, which 96% of the voters favored seceding from Ukraine and rejoining Russia in spring of 2014? When I visited the 3 Crimean cities of Simferopol, Yalta, and Sevastopol in October of 2015, I had conversations with a cross-section of people. from cab drivers and bus riders to small business owners and participants in what is variously referred to by the locals as the Crimean Spring and the Third Defense of Sevastopol. I came away with 3 conclusions. The first is that Crimeans, who are mostly ethnic Russians who speak Russian, were genuinely alarmed by the ultra-nationalist rhetoric and violence coming out of Kiev, which resulted in what they viewed as an illegal coup by extremist elements of the Maidan movement supported by Washington. These extremists had attacked busloads of ethnic Russians from Crimea who had participated in anti-Maidan protests, and the attackers were reportedly on their way into the Crimean Peninsula. Visual number 9. This is cell phone footage from eyewitnesses of the attacks by ultranationalists on busloads of anti-Maidan protesters returning to Crimea. Passengers were forced off the buses. Many were beaten, some were tortured, and a few died. The buses were later set on fire. As a result of this, Crimeans began to organize self-defense units to protect their communities. Secondly, Crimeans did not necessarily think Russia would accept their requests for help. Crimea had been part of Russia from the time of Catherine the Great's reign in the 18th century. During the Soviet era, Nikita Khrushchev had gifted Crimea to Ukraine. Since both Russia and Ukraine were part of the Soviet Union at the time, this was not a problem. However, when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Crimea remained in Ukraine as an autonomous region, while the naval base at Sevastopol was retained by Russia via a lease agreement with the Kiev government. Between 1991 and 2013, Crimeans had voted several times to be reunited with Russia, only to have their requests ignored by Moscow. Putin, as any Russian leader likely would have, viewed the events of February 2014 as a threat to Russia's naval base and only warm water port, since a hostile government in Kiev could unilaterally cancel the lease and allow NATO to de facto take control over the port. This was the fear, as 3 former leaders of Ukraine had urged the canceling of the lease in the aftermath of the coup. It seems unlikely that any Russian leader could have allowed this to happen without making countermoves. Knowing that the Crimean population had repeatedly expressed its desire to be part of Russia, Putin decided on an operation to assist the native Crimeans in blocking both marauding ultranationalists and representatives of the coup government from interfering in activities that would facilitate Crimea's quick reintegration into Russia. Crimeans told me that they knew the so-called little green men were Russian soldiers legally stationed at the naval base who had donned unmarked uniforms. They also told me they viewed them as protectors who allowed them to peacefully conduct their referendum, and not as invaders. Suggestions that these Russian soldiers had pressured them to vote at gunpoint were dismissed as ridiculous by the Crimeans that I spoke to. Third, Crimeans were very happy to be part of Russia. Though they acknowledged that there was still a lot of work to be done, they viewed the future with hope. These sentiments have been borne out in several Western opinion polls over the past several years, including Gallup, Pew, GFK, and Levada, and Foreign Affairs magazine. I conducted an email interview via my fixer in Crimea with 2 representatives of the Tatar community, an ethnic minority with a long history in the area. The Tatar community at the time appeared to be split between a vocal opposition and a segment that was quietly waiting and seeing how things turned out under Russian governance. De facto NATO membership. Visual number 10. Since the Western-backed coup in Ukraine, there have been numerous actions by the US-led West that could be perceived as moving Ukraine closer to de facto NATO membership. Since 2019, the following occurred. The Ukrainian constitution was changed to codify the aspiration for NATO membership rather than neutrality. Over $1 billion worth of weapons had been poured into Ukraine from spring of 2021 through January 2022. The US and other countries trained the Ukrainian military to work directly with NATO. More US, UK, and NATO exercises were held in the region, and US warships increased their time spent in the Black Sea by 150% between 2020 and 2021. In March of 2021, Ukrainian President Zelensky approved a plan to retake Crimea even by use of force. Moreover, 2 important agreements were signed by the US State Department and the US Defense Department with their counterparts in Ukraine in the summer and autumn of 2021. As Benjamin Abelo reported in his book, How the West Brought War to Ukraine, quote, in August of 2021, the US Secretary of Defense and the Ukrainian Minister of Defense signed the US-Ukraine Strategic Defense Framework. This framework translates the NATO pronouncement that reiterated Ukraine would join NATO into a bilateral policy decision to change the military facts on the ground starting immediately, regardless of whether Ukraine was a formal NATO member or not. And 9 weeks after that signing, the US Secretary of State and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister signed a similar document, the US-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership. This document, like the one signed by the Defense Department, referenced NATO's declarations of 2008 and 2021, and it operationalized those statements bilaterally, starting immediately, regardless of what happened with NATO formally, end quote. There was also concern that so-called missile defense systems, similar to those stationed in Romania and Poland, that are believed by the Russian government and independent experts to have offensive capability, could be installed in Ukraine. While it may be true that the country was not going to be officially admitted into NATO anytime soon, it wasn't exactly irrational from Russia's perspective to think, based on the West's own actions, that de facto NATO membership was an ever-increasing reality. As reported by the AP on November 30th, 2021, Putin told the audience at an online investment forum that he was worried about this very thing. Quote, speaking to participants of an online investment forum, the Russian president said that NATO's eastward expansion has threatened Moscow's core security interests. He expressed concerns that NATO could eventually use the Ukrainian territory to deploy missiles capable of reaching Russia's command centers in just 5 minutes. The emergence of such threats represents a red line for us, Putin said. I hope that common sense and responsibility for their own countries and the global community will eventually prevail, end quote. Putin expressed similar concerns a month later in a speech to his military leaders. Quote, over the past few years, military contingents of NATO countries have been almost constantly present on Ukrainian territory under the pretext of exercises. The Ukrainian troop control system has already been integrated into NATO. This means that NATO headquarters can issue direct commands to the Ukrainian armed forces, even to their separate units and squads, end quote. In fact, Putin had tried to explain, in a visibly frustrated tone, to a group of Western journalists during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in 2016 that US and NATO was engaging in provocative behaviors that threatened Russia's security and that he would eventually be forced to act. Visual number 11.
Теперь по поводу ПРО. Послушайте, вот здесь все очень взрослые люди и уже опытные. Мы с вами, я сейчас не буду просить, чтобы вы это все, вот так, как я скажу, отражали в своих материалах, влияли на прессу там, или как. Я просто вам, вот знаете, хочу вам лично сказать, напомнить какие-то вещи. Ведь мир избавлен от крупномасштабных войн и военных конфликтов. Мы с вами все об этом знаем. Благодаря так называемому стратегическому балансу, который был достигнут после того, как угрозы нет, а система ПРО продолжает строиться. Значит, мы были правы, когда говорили, что нас обманывают. С нами неискренне. Но я знаю точно, что мы вынуждены будем отвечать. Только я уже заранее знаю, чтобы нас будут обвинять в агрессивном поведении, хотя это только ответ. Но ясно, что мы должны будем обеспечить безопасность, не только свою. Но нам очень важно обеспечить стратегический баланс в мире. И еще раз вернусь к этому и закончу ответ на этот вопрос с того, с чего начал. Вот именно этот стратегический баланс гарантировал мир на планете, гарантировал нас от крупных вооруженных конфликтов за последние 70 лет. И это благо. Хоть оно такое, знаете, основанное как бы на взаимной угрозе, но тем не менее взаимная угроза, она обеспечила нам глобальный мир на протяжении десятилетий. Как его можно разрушить, так я не знаю. Мне кажется, что это очень опасно. Не только кажется, я в этом уверен.
In December of 2021, Russia proposed 2 security treaties, one to the US and one to NATO, enumerating guarantees that Ukraine would not join NATO and that NATO weaponry and troops would be restricted in Eastern Europe. In a press conference following a video meeting with US President Biden weeks before, Putin had laid out the concept of indivisible security, or the idea that no country or alliance's security should come at the expense of another's as the basis for Russia's demands. On December 21st, during a meeting with his defense ministry board, Putin reiterated his concerns about the threat of NATO weaponry moving closer to Russia's borders, particularly if the alliance expanded to Ukraine. Quote, "It's extremely alarming that elements of the US global defense system are being deployed near Russia. If this infrastructure continues to move forward, and if US and NATO military systems are deployed in Ukraine, their flight time to Moscow will be only 7 to 10 minutes, or even 5 minutes for hypersonic systems," end quote. By the end of January 2022, after some initial progress on peripheral issues, it was made clear by the US and NATO that Russia's main demand would be rejected, insisting that Ukraine's right to join NATO was sacrosanct. At a joint press conference with Hungarian President Viktor Orban, Putin stated, quote, "It is written into Ukraine's doctrines that it wants to take Crimea back, by force if necessary. This is not what Ukrainian officials say in public. This is written in their documents. Suppose Ukraine is a NATO member. It will be filled with weapons. Modern offensive weapons will be deployed on its territory, just like in Poland and Romania. Who is going to prevent this? Suppose it starts operations in Crimea, not to mention Donbass. Crimea is sovereign Russian territory. We consider this matter settled. Imagine that Ukraine is a NATO country and starts these military operations. What are we supposed to do? Fight against the NATO bloc? Has anyone given at least some thought to this? Apparently not," end quote. On February 19, 2022, Zelensky gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference in which he implied a possible willingness to break the 1994 Budapest Memorandum and seek nuclear weapons. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu expressed concern about Ukraine's potential for acquiring nuclear weapons at a February 21st meeting Putin convened with his Security Council. The next day, on February 22nd, Putin responded to a question from a Russian journalist as to whether he thought Ukraine's threat to acquire nuclear weapons should be taken seriously or not. After discussing Ukraine's capabilities for acquiring nuclear weapons, Putin responded, quote, "What is the threat to us? The appearance of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine is a strategic threat to us. Because the range can be extended from 110 kilometers to 300 to 500, and that's it. Moscow will be in the strike zone. This is a strategic threat to us, and that is how we took it. We definitely must and will take it very seriously," end quote. Russia's history of warnings about red lines. The tragic turn of events that followed the 2014 coup and the increased push to get Ukraine aligned with NATO was predicted by Russian officials, including Putin himself, on more than one occasion. The first was during a 2006 meeting with then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, in which Putin tried to impress upon Rice that efforts to bring Ukraine into NATO would be disastrous. According to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who was present, quote, Putin explained what Ukraine was. At least a third of the population are ethnic Russians, and the negative consequences that could arise, not only for us, but for all of Europe if Ukraine and Georgia were dragged into NATO, end quote. American ambassador at the time, Bill Burns, who was with Rice at the meeting, stated that Rice responded by declaring that each sovereign nation had the right to decide for itself which institutions or alliances it wanted to join. Putin reportedly replied, "You don't understand what you are doing. You are playing with fire," end quote. In February of 2008, Ambassador Burns sent a classified cable back to Washington, summing up another meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov about Ukraine's intent to seek a NATO membership action plan, as "niet means niet," Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. The Russians had reiterated again that Ukraine in NATO was unacceptable, citing among other concerns that the issue could precipitate division in the country, perhaps leading to civil war, which would put Russia in the difficult position of having to choose whether to intervene or not, a decision it was stressed that Russia did not want to be faced with. In the midst of NATO expansion, the Bush II administration had also decided to unilaterally pull out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, which was seen as potentially jeopardizing the nuclear balance of power by leaving the US and NATO free to pursue a first strike capability with implementation of an anti-ballistic missile shield. This has allowed the placement of the US NATO missiles in Romania and Poland that has the Kremlin worried about similar future placement in Ukraine. In addition to warnings straight from Putin and other Russian officials' mouths, several experts over the years predicted the dangers of the US and NATO using Ukraine as a cudgel against Russia, including George Kennan, Stephen F. Cohen, and John Mearsheimer. It cannot be plausibly said that this was done out of ignorance by the West of the potential consequences. What contributes to Russia's perception of its national security? Visual number 12. I'm going to start with a reminder about something that I think most Americans take for granted about our own country, and that's geography. With an ocean on either side, friendly or benign neighbors to the north and south, and a nuclear arsenal, an invasion from another country is pretty much impossible. But we still have the Monroe Doctrine, which grants us the whole Western Hemisphere as our security zone, or sphere of influence. And as John Bolton, National Security Advisor under Trump, had reminded everyone, Washington still views the Monroe Doctrine as very much in force. Visual number 13. Russia has a very different geographical reality that has shaped their history and influenced their mentality. They don't have oceans or mountain ranges as a natural form of protection, so they have a long history of numerous invasions from different directions. There was the Vikings in the 10th century, Mongols twice in the 13th century, the Commonwealth of Poland, Lithuania in 1605, Sweden in 1707, France in 1812, and Nazi Germany in 1941. During World War II, the Soviet Union suffered 27 million deaths, mostly due to the Nazi invasion. This included 19 million civilians. 1/3 of the Soviet Union was destroyed. By comparison, the United States lost about 405,000, almost all combatants, and saw no damage to its homeland. Can Americans imagine this level of death and destruction? Do we have anything comparable in living memory? Many living Russians have grandparents and great-grandparents who talked about their experiences of death and destruction in World War II. Victory Day, May 9th, is an important holiday in Russia, and according to polls as of 2017, it is observed by Russians across the demographic and political spectrum. I got a chance to see the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow when I was there in 2017. After the military parades, regular Russian citizens walked through the streets carrying photos of loved ones who served in or were casualties of the war. This is called the Immortal Regiment March. This history played a role in Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev's hesitancy to allow a reunified Germany into NATO in 1989. According to documents released by the National Security Archive in 2017, there is no further debate. Western representatives, including then Secretary of State James Baker, did in fact promise Gorbachev that there would be no further expansion of NATO eastward if he agreed to the reunification of Germany and its inclusion in NATO. After the Cold War, the French and German leadership believed that the best way to bring Russia into the Western fold and encourage its evolution as a democracy was through cooperation and gradual integration. However, many in Washington developed a triumphalist attitude. Soon after the Cold War ended, various interest groups began a heavy lobbying campaign to expand NATO. This included the US arms industry and various political groups, such as neoconservatives, who outlined in a 1992 document known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine how the US must not allow any other nation to become even a remotely threatening competitor to US hegemony in Eurasia. Quote, "Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order of that posed formerly by the Soviet Union. This is a dominant consideration underlying the new regional defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. These regions include Western Europe, East Asia, the territory of the former Soviet Union, and Southeast Asia. Finally, we must maintain mechanisms for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role," end quote. The Wolfowitz Doctrine goes on to basically say that those controlling US government policy ultimately get to decide what form of political government and economic arrangement is best for another nation anywhere in the world, not the people living there and not the recognized leaders of the nation in question. I encourage people to read the Wolfowitz Doctrine at the National Archive website. It should be noted that neoconservatives have served in every administration since Bush II. Victoria Nuland is a neoconservative who was formerly an advisor to Dick Cheney and is married to neoconservative philosopher Robert Kagan, who was a co-founder of the Project for a New American Century, which pushed for a regime change war in Iraq as far back as the 90s. Some basic philosophical tenets of neoconservatives are preserving US hegemony at all costs, that democracy can be imposed on other countries by the US, that there is a perpetual need for an evil enemy, never negotiate with an opponent or enemy, and a deep antipathy toward Russia. The US Committee to Expand NATO brought neoconservatives together with an executive from Lockheed Martin named Bruce Jackson to lobby for the inclusion of Central and Eastern European nations into NATO. From 1996 to 1998, members of this committee wooed politicians from Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, as well as members of US Congress, to implement the first leg of NATO expansion. Another segment of this NATO lobbying effort was composed of members of Eastern European communities with an historical axe to grind against Russia, led by former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. Borrowing from Halford Mackinder's Heartland theory, Brzezinski wrote in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, that in order for the US to maintain its world hegemony in the post-Cold War period, it was critical to control Eurasia. Quote, "About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, and most of the world's physical wealth is there as well, both in its enterprises and underneath its soil. Eurasia accounts for about 60% of the world's gross national product and about 3/4 of the world's known energy resources," end quote. Brzezinski goes on to explain the role of Ukraine as a quote-unquote pivot state. In other words, a state that, if it remains under Russia's sphere of influence, allows Russia to project power into the rest of Eurasia due to its seaport, major resources, and role as a geographic defensive buffer. He believed that the US needed to implement policies to offset, co-opt, and/or control such pivot states so as to preserve and promote vital US hegemonic interests. Brzezinski consistently advocated for policies intended to weaken Russia by goading it into and keeping it bogged down in a war, whether it was in Afghanistan, Chechnya, or Ukraine. Biden administration's admission that it wants to use the Ukraine war to weaken Russia, and its reported opposition to a negotiated settlement in the early months of the invasion is consistent with Brzezinski's philosophy. Brzezinski would go on to serve as a foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama's presidential campaign and met with him as a foreign policy expert in September 2014. By 1999, those lobbying for NATO expansion got their way when US President Bill Clinton broke the promise not to expand the alliance when Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were brought in. This was followed by the entry of Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovenia, and Slovakia in 2004 under the George W. Bush administration. The Bush administration decided on the entry of these 7 additional countries into NATO, which was called the Big Bang, despite the fact that Russian President Putin was the first world leader to call him after 9/11, offering condolences and assistance in fighting terrorism, which included intelligence and logistical support and access to Russian military bases, the latter of which Putin did against the advice of his own national security team. Putin's attitude toward the West. Vladimir Putin did not start out being anti-Western. He was known within Russia as well as in much of the West during his first term and even into his second term as a relatively pro-Western leader. He was more pro-Western than most Russians and more sympathetic to the West than most of the Russian political opposition, which is led, in terms of who gets the most votes, by the Communist Party and the right-wing Liberal Democratic Party. Opposition figures that are liked by the West, like Alexei Navalny and the late Boris Nemtsov, typically poll around 1% to 2% and are not viable competitors, despite having name recognition, because the Russian public simply doesn't like their ideology, which is heavy on neoliberal economics. There's also the perception that they are too cozy with Western forces that don't always have Russia's best interests at heart. Indeed, Putin was often criticized by Russian hawks for being too trusting of the West. Putin did make several attempts to resolve the security conflicts with NATO diplomatically. In 2008, Putin ordered the Russian Foreign Ministry to draft a proposal that Dmitry Medvedev took to Brussels, outlining a security plan that would cover all of the Euro-Atlantic community and Russia, obviating the need for NATO's continued existence, much less its expansion. The preamble stated that the use of force or threat of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state was a violation of the UN Charter and was inadmissible. It also reiterated the intent to cooperatively address any security concerns that may arise among members. The body of the document contains mechanisms for how concerns or breaches of security could be handled. This proposal was sent to the leaders of relevant nations, as well as the heads of the EU, NATO, and OSCE, emphasizing that Russia was open to suggestions and negotiation on the plan. Putin and Medvedev received no response to this proposal. Not long afterward, Georgian leader Mikhail Saakashvili, egged on by elements in Washington, such as the late John McCain, staged a military incursion into South Ossetia, killing Russian peacekeepers and prompting a strong military response by Russia. The 2009 EU fact-finding report on the war between Georgia and Russia does not support the insistence by Washington and the establishment media that Russia started that war. I encourage people to read this report, which is available on the internet. After the illegal change of government in Ukraine in 2014, Putin negotiated the Minsk agreements discussed earlier and pushed for years for their implementation by Ukraine. But as the leaders of Ukraine, Germany, and France have recently admitted, there was never any intention of implementing them. To summarize my presentation, the 8 main points that were discussed today. 1, Ukraine is a historically divided nation. 2, the Maidan protests led to an illegal change of government in 2014. 3, the new Kiev government initiated an anti-terrorist operation, which led to a civil war in the Donbass. 4, how Crimeans viewed the events of 2014. 5, Ukraine's de facto NATO membership. 6, Russia's history of red line warnings. 7, how Russia perceives its national security. And 8, Putin's evolving attitude toward the West. And that concludes my presentation.
very illuminating talk, because I think you have presented so many details and facts that most people are not aware of. So, can you hear me well?
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Maybe you can come up there. Stand here. Yes. I want to thank you very much for your illuminating talk, because a lot of details and facts that you presented, most people are not aware of it, especially it seems like in North America. So there were a few things I wanted to clarify, because there seems to be this impression, if you like go to YouTube and you look at some comments, people still have this impression that it's the Russia that has been perpetrating genocide against people in Donbass. So it's completely twisted. The genocide in the Donbass area, people think it's Russia, it's not really the Kiev government.
Well, it doesn't make any sense, because people in the Donbass have an affinity toward Russia, and they see themselves as having a Russian cultural identity, having Russian customs. They are Russian Orthodox in their religion. They speak Russian primary language. And when this anti-terrorist operation started in Kiev, by Kiev in 2014, it was the Russians that were giving them some covert support. I mean, anybody who thinks that, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the basics of the divisions in the country and of the conflict.
So last week in my dialogue class, this is Joanne Carson, we read an excerpt from Andrew Baichevich's book, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism. And he was very critical of this expansionist kind of attitude in Iraq and also Afghanistan. And I believe he's recently been critical of the US policy toward Ukraine as well, primarily because of the issue that you pointed out about the US breaking its promise about the expansion of NATO into the eastern borders. So I think that's a legitimate criticism, but I mean, I guess my question is, what would you consider to be a rational US foreign policy that would be more based on the notion of containment or balance of power rather than expansionism? What should the US have done?
I think that the US, the bottom line is the US should have taken Russia's national security interest into consideration and negotiated with them. I think this war could have been avoided. I mean, I would like to live in a world where we had some kind of objective body that could justly enforce international law on the world, but we don't have that, unfortunately. And in the absence of that, you know, the reality is that countries that have the power to be able to enforce what they see as their legitimate national security interests are going to do so. And the three countries that have the ability to do that right now are the United States, Russia, and China. So I think the United States, when it takes the position, when it's doing this with both Russia and China, you know, when Russia and China, who are the two other major powers in the world, repeatedly say what their red lines are, and the US's response to that is basically to just dismiss it and say, you know, we don't have to listen to your red lines. We don't even have to acknowledge that you should have red lines. I think that's been extremely reckless. And I think it belies an attitude of just this major arrogance that we've had since the end of the Cold War by being the unipolar power. And we got used to that. We got used to basically telling the rest of the world, issuing dictums to the rest of the world about how it was going to be. And if someone didn't listen, we would either, you know, militarily bomb them or invade them, or if that wasn't really feasible, then we would, implement sanctions. So I think that we've just, it seems to me, because we've had this for 3 decades now, we've gotten used to having this kind of power over the rest of the world, that it seems like people in our government don't even remember how to conduct diplomacy. And that's very dangerous. And we're seeing how dangerous that is right now.
Would you say that in spite of the criticisms of so-called progressive or liberal administrations to conservatives and the polarization that we have in the country, that we're still being guided by neocon principles like the Wolfowitz doctrine? I mean, that seems rather ironic, but would you say that was the case?
Yeah, I mean, we're being divided on, hot button domestic issues, but I think that's kind of a convenient obfuscation of the fact, which is what I think you're pointing out, is that when it comes to some of the most fundamental policies, the two parties don't really have much difference between them. I mean, you might call it neoconservative when it's Republicans doing it, but they're the same policies a lot of times that get pursued Democratic administrations, and they may call it something else like liberal interventionism, or Hillary Clinton called it smart power, I think. But I mean, it's basically the same type of attitude and the same basic types of policies, this arrogance and thinking that we have the right and responsibility to reshape the world in our image and do anything we want. And, I mean, there's a small contingent of Republicans right now that are questioning that don't seem to be supportive of that. But the Democrats don't seem to be questioning that much at all. And we had some very tepid protest months back of supposed progressive Democrats in Congress, I think had a letter about maybe the Biden administration should think about, negotiating about the Ukraine war, and they just got smacked down by the leadership, and they just tucked tail and withdrew it and said, oh, sorry, my bad, we won't ask you for that. So the Democrats have just, I don't see any real change in the Democratic Party right now. And unfortunately, it's the Republicans who have a little bit of protest about this going on right now. But I don't know how much traction they're going to get among the establishment Republican Party with that.
So, as you mentioned about the rationalization of the US foreign policy, how does, now as you showed in, I think, one of the visuals, where there was one naval base in Kazakhstan, one in Uzbekistan, and all of those ex-Soviet bloc countries. So how does US rationalize its power structure without losing any influence over that region? Because, I mean, as you see, the Wolfowitz document does, in a sense, ignore China as a rising superpower. And if, I mean, more or less, China follows a very similar structure of bullying its neighbors as the US does. So instead of leading to another Cold War, isn't the current power structure beneficial in a collective security where most of the nations do not get a say, rather than everyone getting a say and leading to another global scale conflict?
Well, I think the Wolfowitz doctrine didn't really mention China because it was drawn up in 1992, and China wasn't nearly as powerful as it is now, economically and et cetera. I think that you can make an argument like I was talking about, the reality is major powers are going to, enforce what they perceive to be their interests. I think that the United States is showing hubris by wanting to have its sphere of influence cover the whole world. You're talking about the United States basically trying to have control over, thousands of miles away. You might be able to make an argument that the reality of, power politics in the real world, that the United States can have a sphere of influence in its own backyard. And indeed it says that. But when you tell the rest of the world, other major powers on the other side of the world, like China and Russia, that you don't get to have a sphere of influence. We believe in sphere of influences, but only for ourselves and not for any other major power on the other side of the world. I don't think you're going to get a very positive response from other countries about that. It's a double standard. And if a country has enough power to challenge that double standard, they're going to.
And you also said that an individual nation should, like, as the was said, for the NATO expansion, the basis of NATO expansion for Ukraine, that each individual country should have its own opinion, and we've definitely seen where that has led to, I think, a year of war. So why does it happen that when NATO wants to expand, you usually have that whole narrative that's set up that, oh, each country should have its choice, but when it's the whole NATO bloc that wants to go in a country without the permission of others, let's say the whole Afghanistan, let's say Guatemala in back in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, currently in a very covert sense, the Democratic Republic of Congo and all the Eastern Bloc where you have lithium mines and all. Where does that come, where each individual nation does not get its opinion? Does that come down to the Operation Mockingbird, which was the control of media, or does that just come down to politics and, as you said, the American arrogance in the way of conducting diplomacy?
Well, when they want to justify expanding NATO, they then roll out this idea that, well, each sovereign nation has the right to decide which alliances and organizations it wants to join. But when it comes to other countries' sovereignty, when the United States wants to do something to violate another country's sovereignty, suddenly they don't care about sovereignty. So this whole idea about sovereignty is kind of, the West has shown through its actions that it views it very cynically. Whenever it suits its own purposes, they care about sovereignty. And when it doesn't, they just throw that concept out the window.
So could you can I ask a question? So could you please talk a little bit about what implications are going to follow from the current war, the current crisis, because it seems that there are a lot of profound changes happening in international trade, right? Certain countries wanting to create an alternate monetary system. And it seems to me that, right, just going back to your question, that American hegemony, it seems as if it is bringing relative peace in the world, but it seems that just at a very superficial level, because clearly more and more nations are resisting against it. And they are doing their best not to be under the pressure of United States government. So it seems that in the long run, this desire for dominance is going to hurt United States. I think that's really what seems to be happening right now.
I would actually like to challenge that one, because even though you see many countries trying to move away from the dollar dominance or like the petrodollar in a sense, we saw what happened in Libya and we saw what happened in Iraq and Iran. No, sorry, not Iran, my bad. In Iraq.
No, it's true. Of course, they'll do the best. They'll do the best to suppress any alternate system, but Russia and China, not Iran or not Libya. Russia is, I think, very powerful. So it's a very formidable, complicated.
You could say that.
But we'll just, I'm sorry, Natalie. So what is your thought on that? Like what changes do you foresee happening in maybe next 10 years or so? Of course, it's difficult to say with 100% certainty, but it seems to me that something profound is taking place in the world today.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard other people say this, and I agree with it in general, that the world seems to be shifting toward a multipolar world. If you look at history, anytime you've had one really powerful empire it's just not sustainable. You know, you can't do that forever. And all empires, you know, collapse or degenerate. And I think the United States, if we would have had wiser leaders, should have known that and should have seen this coming and would have figured out how to engineer a soft landing, so to speak. But in their arrogance, I think they have overplayed their hand. And I think they're doing things that are actually going to speed up this process in certain ways. What they did with the sanctions on Russia and freezing their foreign reserves, that's just going to make other countries not trust the United States financially. So it's going to make them think that they have to move even more quickly toward alternatives and not being reliant upon the United States financially. I think that dollar dominance will probably not be here forever. I don't know how fast of a process that's going to be. I think it's probably going to take a while. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. But yeah, I think a lot of the rest of the world outside of the West, you know, which is Europe, Australia, Canada, the United States, and New Zealand, that's actually a small percentage of the world's population. Outside of that, I think there's a lot of countries that have had, you know, they have a different experience with the United States and a different experience with Europe. And they've seen that history with the United States and Europe as exploitative. And so I think they've kind of been, I think they are happy to see an opening where they don't have to be so dependent upon the United States and Europe, or have to be forced to kind of, you know, be bullied around by the United States and Europe. So, so in short, yeah, I do think that we're gradually moving toward a more multipolar world.
So also, I think one very disturbing aspect of the way United States has been approaching Ukraine is they seem to be supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine. The US government seems to be supporting, because from what I understand, recently they had some people from the Azov battalion, right, visiting. I don't know if they were invited in the Congress. I don't have all the details, but, and again, this is an aspect that people again may not be very aware of, that there are very radical groups in Ukraine following some form of Nazi ideology, and that they have committed very great atrocities against people. And
yeah,
also this image about Zelensky, which is also, it's just, I think it's ridiculous calling him a democratic leader, calling him a freedom lover, because, right, he has engaged in a lot of oppressive activities. So could you please speak more to that?
Yeah, as I touched on in my presentation, the neo-Nazi ultra-right groups in Ukraine, they have power outside of out of proportion to their actual percentage of the population. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that the majority of the Ukrainian population are neo-Nazi, they're not. But these organizations have disproportionate influence because of their willingness to use violence. And they were used initially in the anti-terrorist operation, because, I mean, there were videos initially when they started this anti-terrorist operation, the Kiev government in 2014 against Donbass. And there were a lot of Ukrainian conscripts that were being sent over into Donbass that just walked away. You know, they got out of their, you had grandmas out there in front of their tanks saying, hey, what are you doing? You know, why are you, don't shell us, don't attack us. And a lot of these soldiers, they just got out of their tanks and said, yeah, these are fellow Ukrainians. We don't want to do this. So they got these neo-Nazi type battalions who were willing because of their ideology and their willingness to use violence, they used them. And, you know, yes, they have had the Azov Battalion visit Congress. And, you know, years ago, media, and there was even legislation in Congress that said, you know, we don't want money going toward the neo-Nazi battalions. Azov Battalion, I think specifically was named. And you did have mainstream media outlets that were admitting that these people existed and, you know, what they did and that they were violent and the kind of warped ideology that they had that was very illiberal. They attacked gays, they attacked feminists. You know, they basically stood for everything that liberals and Democrats in the United States claim to care about. But since the Russian invasion in February of 2022, all of this has just conveniently been swept under the carpet and whitewashed. And Zelensky, as I touched on in my presentation, he has been intimidated, just like the Ukrainian president before him. He's been intimidated by these people who've made it clear that, you know, they threatened him with violence. There was one leader of a neo-Nazi battalion who, it was reported by Ukrainian media in 2021, I think it was, or it might have been earlier, I forget exactly when, but it was before the Russian invasion. That these people said, you know, this guy who was the leader of one of these ultra-right groups said that if Zelensky implements the Minsk agreements, that he'll be hanged from a tree. So Zelensky, you know, I think he did start out being a peace candidate. I think he did really want to try and resolve this without an escalation. But, you know, he was intimidated and he realized, you know, if he wanted to stay alive, that couldn't do it. In the United States, the only way he maybe could have gotten away with standing up to these ultranationalist groups and their threats is if the United States would have supported him, and they didn't.
So do you want to check if who's on Zoom, if they have a question, so you can check it. If somebody else has a question. So again, the mainstream media presents this war as unprovoked invasion by Russia. Of course, you talked about it in your presentation, but could you also say something about why do you think Russia chose that particular time, February 2022, to launch this operation, right? They call this special military operation. Could you speak about it? Why they decided at that particular moment to start this war?
Well, obviously, I don't have a pipeline into Putin's brain. I can only do my best guess. And I don't know what intelligence he had in front of him exactly. But I would say that Putin probably saw all of these provocations that I pointed out in my presentation. And I think he probably thought that, you know, if this isn't resolved diplomatically, as time continues to go on, it's to the point where it's going to be harder for Russia to try and counter this threat. There was a meeting in February 14th, I believe, 2022, that was public. It was a public meeting where Putin was talking to his foreign minister, Lavrov, and was asking him if he thought that it was worth still trying to pursue negotiations with the US and NATO about those the principles laid out in the draft treaties that they had submitted to the US and NATO. And Lavrov basically said, yes, you know, I think that the possibilities for diplomacy have not been exhausted, because Putin pointed out, well, you know, we want to resolve this diplomatically, but, you know, are they just kind of, you know, stringing us along with no real intention of resolving this? And Lavrov said, well, yes, that's a potential issue, but he said, basically, I don't think all the possibilities diplomatically have been exhausted. So he was advocating to continue with diplomacy, and Putin agreed with him. And that's basically how they closed that meeting. And then on February 21st, I think it's clear that by then, when Putin announced that he would recognize Donetsk and Luhansk's independence, I think it was pretty obvious that he had decided that he was going to invade. So obviously something happened in that 1 week that seems to have pushed over into making that decision. Things that may have contributed to it was that speech at the Munich Security Conference that Zelensky had given, where he was suggesting that he may want to pursue nuclear weapons. The other thing was the Wall Street Journal, weeks later after the invasion started, reported that around that same time, the German chancellor had approached Zelensky with kind of a last-ditch effort for a diplomatic resolution, saying, you know, in exchange for Ukraine declaring neutrality and not joining NATO, that they would get security guarantees by Western countries. And Zelensky rejected it out of hand. So those are things that may have contributed, I think, to him deciding, you know, this is just, I've spent years trying to diplomatically resolve this, and it just doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere. There was also, during that time, on the line of contact in the Donbass, there was a major number of Kiev troops amassed on the line of contact, and there had been a significant increase in shelling of the region, as documented by the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. So I think all of these things contributed to him ultimately deciding to do this. And there may have been other things that, you know, nobody really knows about, maybe, I don't know, secret intelligence or something.
So just to play a little bit of devil's advocate, I think we should acknowledge the complicity and, you know, the provocation in U.S. foreign policy that may have led us into the situation that we're in Ukraine. But I guess, first of all, I mean, Russia, I know we should question the media coverage and all of that, as Benita has pointed out, but I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Russia has perpetrated some pretty awful atrocities and human rights violations. And I wonder if we could also look at that side, the responsibility that they hold for making it harder for us to come to some kind of a diplomatic solution. And I wonder if, I mean, is it too late, or can we still revisit this issue in order to stop this war, of maybe backtracking a little bit to not reject, you know, as you say, Zelensky did right before the war began, the idea of the maintaining a neutrality position for Ukraine rather than the expansion of NATO. Given everything that's happened within the last year, is it too late for us to have some hope of being able to do that?
I don't think it's ever too late for diplomacy. All wars have to end sometime. And it's better that, I think, that they end sooner rather than later. So lives are not lost, save lives. Yes, Russia has committed atrocities in this war. Ukraine has committed atrocities in this war also. It's documented that both sides have. And that's war, unfortunately. You know, all sides commit war crimes in war. It's the nature of war, unfortunately. And they're both terrible, and they both are responsible for what they're doing. But, you know, you don't ever have the luxury of choosing an ideal negotiating partner when you're conducting diplomacy. I mean, you don't really conduct diplomacy so much with your friends, you conduct it with your enemies, right? Or your opponents. You know, the main point of diplomacy, the most important part of diplomacy, is stopping or averting conflict. So that's just what diplomacy is. So, you know, it's, even if you think you have an opponent across the table who's horrible, you still have to conduct negotiations with them to get to a mutually agreeable resolution that's going to, in the long run, help all sides. I don't really see any benefit to letting this war continue to go on. I don't think that there's any realistic chance that Ukraine's militarily going to win. And I think that, you know, you're just going to have more death and destruction. I think it's the only thing that's going to come out of letting this war continue on. So no, in answer to your question, I don't think it's too late to negotiate with Russia and end to this war.
Okay, thank you. As long as people are talking, they're not fighting.
Right.
Well, maybe. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So it seems that because just when this war started, Ukraine and Russia were conducting some negotiations, right? They were sitting by the table and trying to find some kind of solution. But it seems that Boris Johnson, right, was the Prime Minister of UK. At one point, he talked to Zelensky and told him, Ukraine is going to win the war, so there's no reason for you to sit down with the Russians, because then you can impose your own conditions. So the point is, some of the Western powers have even pressurized Ukraine to stop negotiations. And if Ukraine is really doing what NATO is dictating, then really, I guess, the conversation will have to be between NATO and Russia. But once again, just given the history of NATO, it seems that Russia is less and less. It trusts less. It doesn't have, at this point, the trust of Russia towards NATO has been broken. I think that's what, this is also the perspective I'm getting from some other sources. Also, the war atrocities, because it seems that some of them are just accusations. There is not a whole lot of evidence, and Russia, in a number of cases, has asked for independent investigation, but there is a refusal to do that. So it's very hard to tell what actually is taking place. It's true.
Yeah, it's very hard to know exactly what's going on, because you have the fog of war, which could be, you know, honestly not knowing enough because of the fog of war. And then also you have, you know, this relentless propaganda campaign by the Western media. So, you know, it's hard to know. And yes, there are a lot of allegations that don't really have a lot of evidence to back them up, but I have no doubt that war crimes are going on both sides, just because, like I said, I mean, that's what happens in war. And I'm sorry, did you have a question in there in what you just said that I didn't address?
Oh, yes. So the first part, it seems to me that Russia at this point, at least from its side, has exhausted all possibilities for resolving this peacefully. And the fact that they've lost trust in NATO powers, I think that makes it very difficult to sit down and try to find the middle ground. But as you said, at some point they'll have to, right? Because this cannot continue indefinitely. But yeah, what exactly is Russia seeking? Like, what is their end goal with the war? What exactly Russia is seeking? Right. So they clearly don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO. But are there other conditions that they are setting on the Kiev government for the war to stop? Well, to answer your question, I'll go a little bit on a tangent here, but it comes back around to answer your question. Very good book out right now, an academic named Nikolai Petro. It's called The Tragedy of Ukraine. And he talks about how, one of the things he talks about is there's really three conflicts going on. There's the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which is the most obvious one on the battlefield. There's the larger conflict between Russia and the US/NATO. Ukraine is kind of being used as a proxy. And there's also the conflict going on within the country of Ukraine, which, as I talked about, the divisions. And I don't think that the US and NATO would have been able to use Ukraine as easily as they have
as kind of a cudgel against Russia. If there weren't those kinds of divisions in Ukraine, that's made it a lot easier for them to do that. So I think in terms of the larger conflict that has to be resolved to some degree between Russia and the US, NATO, is I think Russia wants Ukraine out, obviously, to not be part of NATO. And they also don't want it to de facto be part of NATO. They don't want those missiles placed in Ukraine, which I think they're afraid of because they've been placed in Romania and Poland. And even the Romania and Poland missiles, they view as real threats. So in those, I think what they're seeking is what they asked for in their draft treaties that were submitted in December of 2021. No more NATO expansion, no Ukraine in NATO. And I think they want these missiles moved out. They definitely been placed in Ukraine. And I think they would like to see them moved out of Romania and Poland. Now, how easy that would be to accomplish, I don't know. But I think those are the objectives that Russia wants to achieve. They want to have a security buffer. One.
I need to finish. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So there's also
Thank you very much for the speaker.
somebody else talking. Oh, I see. So I just had one more question, because it seems that Ukraine had a number of bioweapon labs, and this was another issue that Russia had with Ukraine. I think they wanted to shut down, they wanted to make sure that all the bioweapon labs get shut down in Ukraine, because they were doing experiments with very dangerous pathogens. And it seems that they were even trying to collect DNA of people of Russian descent, clearly with the purpose of finding something that they could use to attack Russia. So again, I've been hearing things about it here and there, but I'm curious if you have more information about that.
I've heard a few reports of that from independent journalists. I don't know the extent of it, but I don't think that's one of the primary reasons that Russia went into Ukraine. But it might be, if they can get rid of any threat of a biological weapons lab, that would be something they would want to do. But I don't think that's really like what drove them to invade in February of 2022.
Also, I'm hearing one last, if you have time, I just have one last question if you have time, but it seems the Ukrainian professional army is more or less destroyed. And the reports that we are getting is now Ukraine is forcing almost anyone who can hold a weapon to fight the war. So people with no previous military background, they are given very brief training and sent to the front. So we see elderly people, we see teenagers, we see women. And I'm just curious that just seems like a horrible situation to be in.
Yeah, I have read Ukrainian media reports of that happening, that old men and 16-year-olds are being, that they're just in general more aggressive. The authorities are using more aggressive policies to out and grab people. There used to be certain events or whatever places they wouldn't go to harass people about this, but that's kind of gone out the window. And you're seeing I've read reports that you're seeing people in Ukraine, the authorities going to like funerals or places and just grabbing people as young as 16 and forcing them onto the front lines, basically. Also disabled people who
oh my goodness,
in earlier stages would not have been they wouldn't have attempted to draft them. But they're now even like taking people who are disabled and trying to force them onto the front line. I read an article the other day that a Ukrainian man who was born without hands and actually called up and he tried to say, I'm handicapped. I don't have hands. I clearly can't do this. And they said, no, you have to go. I don't know if he actually did have to go to the front or if he continued to try and fight that. I mean, it seems ridiculous. I mean, I don't even know how you could hold a gun if you don't have any hands, but there are reports of that in Ukrainian media. You are hearing things like that.
And how trustworthy is the information that comes out from the Ukrainian media? How trustworthy is that information? Because it seems like you just have one TV channel or one sort of broadcasting channel, right, directly linked with the government.
Well, they have shut down media that was considered opposition or critical at all of the government. That you're getting media reports from Ukraine that says stuff like this that's not flattering to the government. It might make it a little more credible that they're like this. That's you wouldn't think that the media, the government would want this to get out, but it's really happening. It's probably going to get out eventually.
Yeah, it's a very tragic situation in Ukraine because so many people are displaced, so many people probably have died in the war, and just there's so much destruction and just complete chaos. So I think it's such a great tragedy. But
yeah, it is. I mean, I don't think it had to happen, and it doesn't seem to me. I mean, what I find particularly galling as an American is that the United States, when Russia did invade, stands on the sidelines and acts like, oh, we were just innocent bystanders in this and outraged by it. And, it just is so cynical, to say the least. And it's infuriating to me personally.
Because it seems that Russia initially, they were very concerned about not killing civilians, making sure that civilians are not dying. So they were very concerned about reducing the number of deaths of civilians. But clearly that cannot be done anymore because now it's a full-fledged war. So it seems that if NATO, if the United States had intervened at the right time, or they would have sat down on the negotiation table, it seems things wouldn't have gone so far. Where now you have a full-fledged war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that the longer a war goes on, even if you go into it hoping to, I mean, some people interpreted Russia's military actions in the beginning as they were going quote unquote soft, that they were trying to avoid civilian casualties. And because it was a NATO country, they didn't really want to do shock and awe and destroy everything. And, even if that's true, then, the longer the war goes on, they're not going to be able to do that forever. But yeah, I think that the Russians were hoping that they could quickly get the Kiev government to realize, we need this and let's just negotiate an end to this. I think that there are signs that they were willing to do that, but the West didn't want them to do that.
Very unfortunate.
Yes, the U.S., again, the media and U.S. government acts outraged by what they're doing, but they are kind of using this to their own benefit. I don't see any evidence that the United States really cares about Ukrainians. I think they're perfectly willing to just let Ukrainians sacrifice Ukrainians if they think that it to, in the long run, benefit their geopolitical goals.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm really hoping for the best for the Ukrainians, and of course, hoping greatly that there would be a quick resolution of the conflict, though, of course, it's very difficult to predict when it's going to end. But thank you so much for giving this presentation. I really greatly enjoyed. I still have to finish reading your second book, I think Rush. I'm sorry, I don't have the title with me, but I really enjoyed reading the first book. It's very disturbing, a lot of disturbing details, but I think it gives a very accurate picture about the situation. So really, I greatly appreciate the time that you have taken to give this presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.